Hi everyone, in this tutorial I'm going to show you how I did this drawing of a kitten in graphite. Now this video is going to have lots of tips for drawing tabby fur, and then also at the end of this video I'm going to have some tips on how to draw out of focus fur. But as always, before I start with the fur, I like to get the eyes drawn in first. Now usually I would draw the left eye and then work on the surrounding fur, but for this drawing, because the eyes were very similar in their tonal values, the light source, there wasn't too much difference between the left and the right eye, I decided to draw them both here initially. Now a big tip when drawing any eye that has a bright reflection or a highlight at the top is I like to allow the white of the paper to show through first of all, and then I can always darken that with my subtle layers of graphite if I need to tone that down. But by leaving the white of the paper free, we already know then right from the beginning that we've got that sharp contrast in place with that bright highlight. So that's something here that can make a really big difference to any eye that we're drawing. Now when I start to build up my darker values here, you can see that I'm doing that in stages. I haven't just jumped into my darkest pencil first. I want to make sure that I've increased that depth through every layer that I add. Now something else that can make a really big difference when drawing realistic eyes is the shading. So here, as I start to build up the graphite in exactly the same way as I did the left eye, I'm going to focus on any darker areas around the top of the eye and on the edges. And you can see there that that's already established with that very first layer of graphite powder. So with a small paper blending stump, I'm going to put more of that darker graphite powder on the outer edges, and that's already going to then create the beginning of that sphere shape. Coming back in with my graphite pencils and occasionally a little bit of a putty eraser just to pull in some of those highlights, it really helps to emphasize that realistic three-dimensional shape that we're after. Now the reason I like to get the eyes drawn in is just because that's where the main emotion stems from. So if I can get that done first of all, I already feel like I'm in a better frame of mind to then tackle the rest of the drawing. Now graphite powder features in every single one of my graphite drawings, and here I'm using that same small paper blending stump and focusing on the main lights and darks. Now when drawing tabby markings, it's really important to make sure that those main sets of markings, those darker stripes, are in the right place. Now when working with pet portraits, these stripes are very unique to that one individual animal, so the owner of that pet is going to know if one of the stripes is in the wrong place, if we've added too many or not enough. Now there are some, if we're working on a smaller scale, that we can't include, but I do want to make sure that I've got the bulk of those in place first of all, so that I can then follow my reference photo more accurately as I begin to draw the fur in between. Now the fur here that is around those darker stripes, this is where I feel the tabby markings and the coloration of that fur become a little bit more challenging to draw. This fur isn't necessarily drawn dark to light or light to dark. There is a process where I like to use my darker pencils. I build up those values in stages, but I'm always at in between layers pulling in more of my highlights. Now this gives me a really nice balance between that impression of those light and dark hairs that are mixed in within those same layers. Now to capture this here, on top of my layer of graphite powder where I've already hinted at a softness with those midtones, I'm starting off with a HB pencil, and then I will just be focusing on mapping in my fur direction. As I start to then work with my darker pencils now, you can see that I'm not looking to put those dark layers everywhere. I'm hinting at where those darker hairs are in between those lighter values, and then pulling in more of my eraser techniques on top to again add those highlights in between those layers. Now of course there are many ways to get to the same end, but I do find this approach simplifies this unique fur texture. Being able to work out each individual layer in that one section that I'm working from just means then that this is less likely to get overwhelming. Now going back to something where we can simplify this process and make this less daunting, the reason I start off with a HB pencil on top of my graphite powder layer is because I'm only looking to draw my fur direction. I'm not trying to capture here that end result, I'm just breaking it up into one layer at a time. So when I start an area that's new, that's got no pencil work, that first HB layer, depending on the light or darkness of that photo, it may not be HB. I could use a 2H, for example, for a lighter coat. but it's this first layer here that I'm currently working on where I'm only mapping in my fur direction. If I can map in my fur direction here, I don't actually have to then consider that nowhere near as much as I start to work with more of those complex layers that I'm adding on top. So I just find that first layer is really beneficial for making this drawing and this difficult fur texture that much easier. Now when I am working with that very first layer of pencil where I am mapping in my fur direction, and then as I'm starting to reinforce my darker hairs at this stage and as well those highlights, other factors with that pencil technique come into consideration. So it's not just the fur direction, it's the fur length and the fur thickness. So I need to be making sure that that pencil is in contact with the paper for the right amount of time, depending on how short or how long the fur needs to be, and then that the thickness of those pencil strokes are also accurate. Now the thickness of the pencil strokes is determined by how sharp the lead is, how we're moving and holding the pencil, how much pressure we're applying, and all of these factors, because they do make such a big difference, all of this is covered in my real-time step-by-step lessons. Because I do record these tutorials with a voiceover while I'm drawing, I'm able to explain everything in the moment. So if those lessons are of interest, I will link more information to those in the description below. Now when it comes to working on the ears, this is something where I really want to capture those lighter hairs over a darker base. Now I think this is one of those occasions where it can make it look quite daunting, because that fear of not being able to pull in those bright highlights over the top could actually then make us want to use a lighter base layer. Now the problem with that is then that the lighter hairs that we're adding on top with our erasers, they're not going to look as light because the base layer underneath isn't dark enough. Now of course again there are different ways to get to the same end, so if you want to work with your light layer of graphite powder or a light pencil layer, pull in your eraser highlights, put in those lighter inner hairs, you can then take your darker pencils and draw in between those lighter values to make those base layers look darker. The only reason I don't prefer to use that approach is it can make it look like those lighter or whiter hairs have been drawn around. It doesn't really make them look as natural, like they've just been sitting on top of that inner ear, which obviously is how they would naturally be. So my preference is to work with a darker base layer and then use my erasers to pull those highlights in place. But again, there are many different techniques that we can use here. Now one thing that can make a big difference with highlights or shadows is if there is a situation where you don't feel like, for example, your highlights are bright enough, but you are confident that you've got your base layer dark enough, but you still feel like you want that highlight to be brighter, then that's an indication that what is next to it isn't dark enough. So for example, the highlight in the eye. If I know I've left the white of the paper visible, but it still doesn't look bright enough, it could then be that the darker part of the eyelid around the highlight isn't dark enough. Now by darkening that up, it will automatically make that highlight next to it appear brighter. So that would be the same with those lighter eyebrow tabby markings. If I want those to look lighter, I would need to darken up the tabby markings in between, and that would automatically then adjust my contrast without me having to actually lighten those tabby markings. So that is one other thing to consider with any drawing. Now when working on the muzzle area of a cat, it doesn't matter if it's a domestic cat like this or a wild cat, a tiger, a lion, whatever it may be. Usually the fur around the nose is going to be significantly shorter than that on the rest of the face. So at this point here, I need to be looking at which of my pencil techniques I need to adjust. Now primarily this is going to be the length of those pencil strokes. I still want to be making sure that I'm following the fur direction, but the length of the pencil strokes has to be adjusted. I need to be making sure that I'm shortening those here to get that variation in that fur texture. Now depending on how big the drawing is that you're creating, this area of the animal would be potentially very small. So in this situation we wouldn't actually want to be forcing too much individual fur direction either, because it can make the appearance of more textured fur, something that might be a little bit too wiry. So if this area around the nose is much smaller on that drawing that you're working on, then it might just be that to create that realistic look to the fur, we need to use more shading techniques. And this portrait here does demonstrate that very well, in that there's not many details at all on the muzzle area. Now onto the outer focus body. I have used a different approach and I'm using a lot more of my graphite powder for my base foundation. I'm using as well an eye makeup applicator in some of the areas where it's more blurry because that's going to give me a softer look than what a paper blending stump will do. Now by adjusting with these different tools, I can then create that level of blurriness that I need. If the fur is more out of focus, like this side section, I am going to favour using that eye makeup applicator because it's just going to get to that end result of that out of focus effect far quicker. Now you can do this with a paper blending stump, but it's just going to take a little bit more time. And just because the paper blending stump is much more of a firmer applicator compared to the sponge on the eye makeup applicator, it does more likely create some of that harshness to each of those blending strokes that you create. So using a mixture of these two tools work really well, especially for something like this where the body at the back of the animal is more out of focus than the front legs. Now, as I mentioned earlier on, graphite powder features in all of my graphite drawings, but for something like this where the elements are out of focus, it can create that effect so much quicker with less work. Now I would never use a technique just because it's faster, but in this situation it's the best of both worlds. I feel like I get the effect that I want and I can speed up that application at my base layer stage. Now when I start working with my graphite pencils here, again it's the same concept like I would be working with any fur. The fact that it's out of focus just means that I need to work with a little bit more of my softening techniques when I'm using my pencils. But I'm still following the fur direction, the fur length and the fur thickness. Now the fur thickness with out of focus fur obviously is going to have much more of a softer appearance, so that means that we need to have less of our finer lines. If the pencil strokes that we're creating on a section that should be a little bit blurry are too thin, then that's going to pull focus to that area and give the impression of more detail. So I want to be making sure that I do have that balance right with the pencil technique. Now I like to work in small sections. I find that I can then work through an area far more effectively. I'm definitely more efficient with the layering process. Now if you are an artist who likes to work in whole individual layers, then of course that's fine if it works for you. But if you do feel like you're hesitating at some point, maybe you're not quite sure where you should be working on your reference photo, then that is an indication that maybe the area is just a little bit too big. By scaling that down one section at a time, it can make it a lot easier to work through. Now on this area with the front legs, when I do work with my highlights, I favoured using my putty eraser. The reason being, the putty, I can actually mould that to the shape that I needed, the desired thickness, and I was able to create the clumped effect with that out of focus fur. If I'd have used more of my Tombow mono eraser, then I'm going to create the impression of those finer highlights, which again is going to make that look more in focus, which is what I want to avoid for this area of the drawing. When I'm working on the paws here, you can see that I've now shortened the way that I'm using my graphite blending stump. So this doesn't matter if it's a blending stump or a pencil. I want to still be following that fur direction and the fur length. Now if I was to keep my pencil strokes the same length on the foot as I was the top of the leg, then the fur around that paw is going to be really furry and fuzzy, which of course is not how this is going to be. So by making sure that we are adjusting the length of that, it's going to really help when we start to then build up more of those layers going forward. Now, my biggest tip when drawing hands or feet of any animal or person is to just focus on the shapes that you see. So here again, I'm just using my graphite powder. You could use a pencil here, you don't have to use the graphite powder, but because this foot was also still out of focus, I preferred to use the graphite powder here as well. But all I'm doing is, again, just mapping in my main lights and darks. By doing that, rather than trying to draw each toe to force that shape, it means that I'm able to actually follow my reference photo more accurately. Now, our brain is great at trying to sort of trick us into thinking we know what a cat's foot looks like. So we start to drift away from that reference photo. Now, if that happens, the toes can end up taking on a very strange shape. So it can then be quite discouraging and we can end up feeling like we've deformed that foot in some situations. So by just focusing on the lights and darks, especially when it is out of focus like this, it can really help to make that section of the drawing much easier. Now, I do actually have an in-focus cat paw study tutorial, and I've got a time-lapse version of that here on YouTube as well. I'll link that in the description below if it's of interest, because in that video I really do show much more of that structured layering process, how to break that up one step at a time, so that when we are drawing paws that are in focus, we're not getting too overwhelmed by the detail and we're still making sure that we're following the correct proportions of that foot. So if that is of interest, I will make sure to link that in the description below. So I do hope this video has been useful. If it was, I'd be very grateful if you could give it a like and a thumbs up. It makes a huge difference to my channel. If you would like to draw along to this real-time tutorial, then I will link all of that information in the description below. If you do have any art-related questions, feel free to pop them in the comments. I'm more than happy to help if I can. And I do also upload 2 videos to YouTube every week, so if you would like to get notified of that content, then don't forget to hit the subscribe and the bell button. I'm going to be uploading another video next week, but as always, thank you so much for watching.